What's up, sons? It's Blind Rod with Son of a Tech once again, and today I'm going to do a talking head video. Today we're going to be discussing decentralization, what it is, how it pertains to cryptocurrency, and all of the different aspects that are involved with cryptocurrency and decentralization, from nodes to mining to volume to exchanges and all of those goodies. I just want to get some things off my chest, some things I've been thinking about a lot lately. Hopefully you will find this video informative and at least conversation inspiring. Let's go ahead and hop into it. So if you do a quick Google search for decentralization, you do get some pretty good information, at least from a macro perspective. The definition in the dictionary is the transfer of control of an activity or organization to several local offices or authorities rather than one single one. The idea of decentralization has been around for centuries and really was sparked in government initially, right? So we're talking about the governance of people within a certain geographical location. Most famously would probably be the United States, where you have things known as states' rights that trump in a lot of cases your federal rights. And that is because you are decentralizing the power points over the individuals based on their even closer and smaller geographical locations, with still an overarching head. This is kind of one of the ways to decentralize. So if you think about decentralization as a whole, it doesn't always necessarily mean completely decentralized, right? We'll kind of go over a graph here in a second. You can have parts and forms of decentralization on a gradient scale, right? So you could have completely centralized all the way to the very far end of the other spectrum, which would be completely decentralized, which would mean at any point a single individual could participate without any other individual's knowledge or whatever, and maintain autonomy, blah, 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 and be able to participate within whatever governance is going on in that particular field, right? Whether it's finance or law or whatever it may be. So complete decentralization to a certain extent, right? Like, if we're going to be like completely honest, is impossible, right? And idealistically, fully decentralized system is basically impossible. The point of everything being decentralized or becoming more decentralized is to move towards decentralization, not necessarily completely remove all centralization. And as it pertains to cryptocurrency, this can be quite confusing to some people, and I'll try to explain it in each different aspect. But the goal ultimately is to push towards further and further more decentralization, but you'll never get there, right? That's kind of my point. You'll never actually get to full decentralization. That's impossible, philosophically impossible, at least in this particular case. So let me do this and show you guys a quick diagram I wrote out in Paint so you guys can get a very basic idea, with centralization being on the left and decentralization being on the right. Essentially what you can see here is you have this entity in the middle that controls, let's say in this case, all of the data, all of the transactions that each of these individuals have made with each other. And without access to this particular entity and data, this individual cannot participate in the system with the rest of the individuals. Basically, if this line gets erased, let me get the eraser here, boom, this individual is now unable to participate within this system with the other individuals completely. As opposed to that, what you have is each individual having access to all of the transactions at any given time from all other participants within the system. So if you basically cut off communication from this person to this person, they still are communicating with the other individual that also has all of the transactions from this individual, and thereby you can find what is called consensus on that network. So that means that basically you can't eliminate this individual completely from the system unless all other participants decide to go against this participant. So what would have to happen is you would have to erase all lines and all communication from all parts of the network, and then that would get rid of that individual. This is how, for example, you would consider essentially blockchain handling bad actors, right? The way that typically happens is this line stays connected as long as, or these lines stay connected as long as all of them are finding consensus on all of the transactions within the ledger. So this individual, if this individual comes out and tries to do something like a double spend, or basically does something against the rest of the consensus for the network, it might be cut off. And then that would result in potentially something that's called a fork, for example. So what you would end up seeing there is, let's say this individual gets cut off from the rest of the network, right? Which here recently happened to me, funny enough. But this individual could end up creating their own system with their ledger, and other people could sync to it and then be a part of that. So that's how you go from having previously Ethereum Classic to then Ethereum. Now, some people would argue, obviously, that Ethereum Classic is the true and maintains it, and that Ethereum is not. But that is basically kind of how that happens. Essentially, it cuts itself off from the rest of the group and kind of creates its own new group here with a completely different ledger. Now, this is important to understand when we start talking about other aspects, and here's where it gets a bit confusing, because when we talk about centralization as it pertains to cryptocurrency, we have multiple aspects within cryptocurrency that can be centralized or decentralized, right? So when we talk about that, there is basically all of the nodes that are providing consensus. Now, nodes can be a tricky subject because nodes don't always necessarily refer to the traditional node you would see in Bitcoin. There are nodes that also provide consensus, things like master nodes, for example. There are nodes that are just for processing power, in the case of Flux, for example, but that's not necessarily the consensus node that is basically providing the ledger data or storing the ledger data to every other individual. So for today's argument, we're going to stay extremely basic and just focus on basically what Bitcoin does, right? So for Bitcoin, for example, you have nodes. Those nodes communicate with each other, storing the ledger, which is all of the transactions of all of the participants, and then broadcast that out, and anybody can download that and participate in that ledger. So basically we go back to here, you have the original node that started, and everybody starts syncing around them, and everybody agrees that that is the proper ledger to pay attention to and focus on. So increase decentralization, that is why people encourage you to build nodes, is because you end up drawing more lines to more participants, which further decentralizes the network and gives more people access to more parts of the network, right? It can just keep going. You could, in theory, you would have a line from this node to every single node. Every single node would have a connection to each other's node, but that is not necessarily required. You just have that option. These are peers, right? This is a peer-to-peer network. If you guys aren't familiar, this is basically coming off the back of something like BitTorrent or torrenting, where each individual computer would have a full-fledged file, and pieces of that file would be sent from multiple different locations to the person receiving that file. And then once that person has the file, they do what is known as seeding, and let other people download portions of that file from their particular file. Napster was a famous one that obviously had done part of this, and then there were other applications and so on that did this as well. So that is basically decentralization of the actual ledger, the record of transactions on the network. And there are a lot of different things that you could play into here. We've seen in the past, obviously, broken chains where you've had pruning, for example, and nobody has an archival node, which can cause issues. There are issues that can be caused within these networks that stop this from actually functioning perfect as well. Just a side note, we could talk about all of that in a completely different video if you're interested. So essentially, you have to have you need to build more and more and more and more Bitcoin nodes so that you can decentralize further and further and further and further. And this is actually a great point for anybody that actually owns Bitcoin. If you want to be a full-fledged participant, you should be running your own node because, hey, the more nodes that there are, the less likely there's going to be an ability for basically somebody to be a bad actor and screw up the ledger, thereby screwing up, obviously, your transactions. So the reason Bitcoin's so ubiquitous is because of the size of its infrastructure and the amount of nodes that have been built. And the more it is very decentralized from a node perspective. But that's not the whole story, right? Because then we have basically the consensus mechanism, which could be proof of stake or proof of work. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about proof of work, and we can talk about proof of stake versus proof of work in another video as it pertains to decentralization if you like, but I just want to give you the basic concepts here so that philosophically we can talk about what we should want to see from a particular blockchain. So in a proof of work environment for blockchain, essentially you're going to have processing power that's communicating with the nodes and basically receiving and solving blocks. And the idea here is that you also need to decentralize this particular processing power that is solving the blocks so that you don't have essentially block builders submitting bad blocks to the network. Essentially, you can have bad actors within that as well. It still functions sort of the same, except imagine that these empty squares are now essentially miners, and the miners are going to go around and talk to the nodes and signal back to the nodes the solved blocks, and then the nodes will go around and talk to each other and find consensus and say, okay, we'll accept this block. All the transactions within this block on this ledger we're going to add to the permanent record of the ledger, and then we'll basically pay back the miner for that. So there's an important aspect here of decentralizing the processing power that's being utilized as well to solve blocks. And this is where the arguments between basically application-specific integrated circuits and traditional consumer-grade hardware like CPUs and GPUs comes into play. Obviously, the argument being there that if you have consumer-grade products that are available to everyone, more people are able to purchase them, which means you have less people that are or more people that are in control of participating within the network, and that is pushing towards further and further decentralization. Remember, keeping in mind that we will never have perfect decentralization. This also means that you can have centralization at multiple different levels, right? You can have centralization from the mining perspective at the manufacturer of the equipment being used to mine. You can have centralization at the mining farm level, where one mining farm has more hash power than the rest of the network, thereby having more control over the network. And then, of course, those are the two primary. And so when we talk about the advantages of like CPU and GPU versus ASICs, the argument there would be is that there's less manufacturers of application-specific integrated circuits than there are of CPUs and GPUs. Thereby, the manufacturing point of these are basically going to be less or more decentralized, just depending on how many actual manufacturers you have. But then there's also access to take into account, where individuals that are miners, how much access to the mining equipment do they have drives how much decentralization or there is or isn't as well. So there's multiple aspects here too when we discuss this thing. And that is extremely important to take into account. For example, if you have like a single entity like Bitmain that makes all of the mining hardware for a particular network, well, you can find yourself in some trouble, because at the manufacturing level, they could put in exploits into the firmware, into the control boards, etc., which is actually a good point when we talk about Bitcoin in general too. Replacing control boards and having third-party control board manufacturers actually has the potential of further decentralizing the network from a mining perspective, which I think is a very valid point and is something that you should consider when we're talking about all this. Once again, this is philosophically, I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm giving you an idea where all of these arguments actually come from. And that access, though, going back to the access that the mining farms have to the equipment, is a large driver as well, because if the mining farms have an unfair advantage in access to equipment, which was seen both in GPUs and ASICs as well as FPGAs, not so much CPUs, then you have a centralizing point or a more centralized point on that graph as well, right? Because then one mining farm has access to that, and then you run into issues. So this is kind of when I say I support GPUs over ASICs, reasoning being is that there is more consumer access to that hardware for mining, thereby theoretically pushing forward decentralization down that graph and less towards the centralization side, right? We're kind of just doing this back and forth on, if you imagine a line here and decentralization over here, I would say, if it's GPUs, then consumers have access. So we push that line a little bit further down the decentralization line, right? There's the final aspect of this too, which is the actual control over the total quantity of whatever the asset is. And this is something that I think gets ignored a lot within cryptocurrency and is a centralizing factor that is massive. This is why you have started seeing projects have rich lists so people are aware. And what blockchain does very well, at least non-private blockchains, is transparency. And you should take advantage of that and look at how transparent these projects are when it comes to how large or how much of that asset is in a small amount of individuals' wallets, right? Because if you essentially have a large amount of that asset, you can control price. In the perfect world, you would say that this becomes not a problem when said asset becomes the reserve currency. Like, let's say Bitcoin becomes the reserve currency. It's a little bit less of an issue and you're pushing a little bit more towards decentralization, but it is a much larger issue when that asset is based on a different reserve currency like the US dollar, because you can manipulate the value of that currency or that asset based off of the access to that or the amount of that asset you have, and basically influence the price, right? So this is the centralization point that I think a lot of people miss, and pushing for more decentralization. This is a problem too, especially because I think a lot of people within cryptocurrency are like hardcore capitalists, right? And so you mentioned that you need to spread out the currency or disperse the currency, at least initially, more evenly, so you have less potential of manipulation of the market. Well, that sounds like communism, right? So we kind of have a little bit of an ideological, theoretical issue here when it comes to how you start networks and so on. I mean, and when we talk about proof of work mining in particular, the way that people decide to solve this that is both fair as well as pushing towards more decentralization is something called, well, a fair launch, meaning that the blockchain is launched and presented to the public from the very first block that is mined from the Genesis block on. And this isn't done near as much as you would think it's been done, because there are a ton of new projects that generate basically a dev fee right off of the Genesis block that goes to a dev wallet. And that's something to pay attention to and is a big problem. The other thing here is that the thing that they'll do as well is they'll have more specialized mining hardware for that particular project, or access to that mining hardware, than other individuals have. I think that one of the things that people got very upset with kaspa on was, well, they missed the fair launch, right? I was part of the fair launch, so I'm not a part of that crowd. But there are a certain amount of people that were like, hey, all these miners, due to the fast emissions, were getting a bunch of the volume of the cryptocurrency early on, and we didn't. Well, obviously, the proponents for that are going to say, well, you missed the boat. It was still fair launch, and so on. And this is, I think, a valid point, because this is a problem that's frankly difficult to solve. You want to decentralize the amount of currency across wallets of that asset, across a bunch of different wallets, ideally. But at the same time, how are you going to ever start a project unless you, well, actually start it? And how is the word going to get out unless you actually start the project, right? There are other things, I think, on the token level where people will do airdrops and drop them to every available wallet. But even in that particular case, you have individuals that might not have an ETC or an ETH or an ERC, excuse me, 20 available wallet, or not even have an Ethereum wallet that would have access to that yet anyways. So at some point, people are not going to get the perfect even distribution of the asset, regardless of what anybody might want to see ideally down that decentralization line. So once again, the point of talking about all of this is to essentially make everybody aware of what decentralization is and what the final goals really look like. A perfect decentralized system will never happen. However, to say, oh, throw your hands up and completely give up is also not the way to do it. I think these are things that need to be discussed, talked about, especially in a lot of the altcoin discords. People should talk about this. Hey, how can we make it more decentralized? How can we push further, right? What are the things? What are some technologies that we could do? What are some strategies, economic strategies we could do to make it more decentralized in all three forms, from all three aspects, right? I mean, incentivizing people to build nodes. Incentivized nodes, though, have also turned out to be a complete disaster. I'll talk about this more when I break this up into individual videos later on. I'm going to do one that's proof of work versus proof of stake, and talking about the issues between both of them as far as those are concerned. We'll talk about, I think, mining hardware and the differences between, GPUs, ASICs, and CPUs as it pertains to decentralization specifically in more detail. And this is kind of something that I want to put out there, have discussion about, so we can just push everything forward into, well, my goal would be a more decentralized state and less centralized, because I do think at the end of the day, the goal should be more decentralization, not more centralization, while also being realistic about the actual limitations surrounding decentralization as it pertains to that. Let me know what you guys think about all of this down in the comment section below. I'm definitely curious, and this is obviously to open up conversation. So I'll be happy to talk to you about it on Twitter at sonofatech, or of course on my locals at sonofatech.locals.com. Or if you somehow find my Discord, well, good on you. You can try to DM me, and we'll see how well I can get back to you as far as that's all concerned. I will see you next Tuesday.